Well, hello everybody, and greetings. It's wonderful to be doing a webinar about our forthcoming Esoteric Quest. I never cease to be amazed by the technology here. Leonard is joining us today from British Columbia, and Harold is joining us today from Iceland, and Pete and I are in New York. So it's great that we can do this. For those of you who are new to the Esoteric Quest, let me just give you a little bit of background. The Open Center has been doing these conferences now for, this is our 21st year. I certainly never imagined back in 1995 when we did the very first one in Bohemia, a beautiful little town called Český Krumlov, the mecca of alchemists, that we would have done 12 conferences over the last 20. And they've all been wonderful, I have to say. But we've done 5 or 6 esoteric quests around the Mediterranean, from the island of Samothrace in the Aegean, where we explored the mysteries of antiquity, to the Library of Alexandria, our partner there in Egypt, looking at the Greco-Egyptian world, Alexandria, to Sicily, Granada, the Golden Age of Andalusia, Florence, the Italian Renaissance, and the esoteric tradition. So we've had a wonderful sequence of quests around the Mediterranean and the South, really, in many ways. But this year, this is a new venture for us, to journey into the realm of the mysteries of the North. And I must say, it's been a fascinating experience for me. As I direct the quest, part of the pleasure for me is the enormous amount of learning that comes to me, and I have just been loving entering into the world of Viking mythology, the beauty of the Icelandic landscape, and attuning to these wonderful mysteries of the North. So, these quests do not unfold in some normal linear way. I think there's an inequality of intuitive direction or guidance. Nobody would have imagined that we would go from last June, where we were in Carcassonne, in Languedoc, looking at the world of the troubadours and the Cathars, to looking at the world of the Vikings and the Icelandic sagas and the poetic Edda, and this whole wonderful world of Norse mythology that has always captivated me, I must say, from a very early age, and I'm thrilled to be going into it more deeply. So, today, Leonard will be on first. He'll be followed by Haraldur. Then we're going to leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So let me say a few words. Well, before I introduce Leonard, let me thank Haraldur again. One of the things that has made this quest possible is that on one of our esoteric quests in Central Europe in 2006, from Renaissance Bohemia to Goethe's Weimar, I met Haraldur Erlendsson, who a wonderful man who's going to be joining us in Iceland, who's based in Trondheim, Norway. And when the idea came up, and I think Leonard was the first to suggest it, of doing a quest in Iceland, I thought, well, I will contact Haraldur. He's a Facebook friend of mine, and see if he knows anybody there. And he put me in touch with Haraldur. Haraldur and I had one long Skype call, and it felt like the whole esoteric quest rolled out in front of me. So I'm really grateful to both Haraldur in Trondheim, Norway, and to Haraldur in Iceland for making this possible. It's been really a priceless gift. Haraldur has opened up so many connections and worlds in Iceland. We couldn't have done it without him. So let me go on now and introduce Leonard. Leonard has spoken at many of our esoteric quests. Leonard has a wonderful gift of contextualizing the different mystery and esoteric streams that we explore in each quest. Leonard is the author of 2 books, a wonderful encyclopedia, as it were, of crimes of perception, of heresies and heretics. It's really a very thorough and deep and impressive book. And also Alternative Realities on Altered States of Consciousness. Leonard's day job is that he is the head of the psychology department at Capilano University in North Vancouver. Leonard and I first met at the esoteric conference we did in Florence on the Italian Renaissance and the esoteric traditions. and it's been a pleasure to have Leonard with us on so many of the quests since, and to get him to know him personally so well. So Leonard, thank you very much for doing this. It's great to have you here, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Ralph. It's certainly an honor to be involved in this project, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who is with us. What I'm going to do in my brief time here is to give a very brief overview of some basic facts and some basic ideas. And just to point out, this event is being recorded, and it will be available to all participants to review at your leisure later. So my suggestion is just relax, go with the flow, and let's see where we end up. So, like Ralph, I'm marveling at the technology of this event, that I'm in Vancouver, British Columbia. Dr. Haraldur Erlendsson is in Reykjavik, Iceland. That's like the other side of the world. And here we are together to share this with you. It's a beautiful morning, as you can see, in North Vancouver. But let's cast our minds today north. Let's go northward. Let's think about Northern Europe, Scandinavia, and mainly to Iceland, which has a reputation for wonders, such as sea monsters, as you can see. And if you look just above the head of that lovely seahorse that we see here, you can see the location of the New York Open Center Conference coming up this August. The conference will be meeting at the foot of the great Snaefellsjökull, the volcano with a glacier on top. And there's the location again on the Snaefellsness Peninsula in western Iceland. But a question arises, where is Iceland? Now, at least in the non-Icelandic imagination and maps, Iceland is usually located right at the edge. As you can see in this Eurocentric version, there's Iceland barely on the map. So in the Western imagination, there's something that connects Iceland with being on the edge. But also, if we think about it, in terms of the range of the presence of the old Norse culture, Iceland is really in the center. And so Iceland has this interesting quality of being at the edge and also, in its importance in many ways, at the center. And that creates an interesting zone, really, for Iceland in the Western imagination, a sense of liminality, of being in between. And liminal spaces are spaces of special possibilities and are often connected to esoteric topics and esoteric quests. So let's go there. What I aim to do is quite succinctly, I hope, say a few words just introducing the connection between the North and specifically Iceland and this sense of liminality. Do a very quick hello to the outer North, in other words, a few anchor posts of relevant history, and then look at the inner North, the spiritual life and legacy of the old Northern culture. That's my plan. So, the liminal North. Let's start in the south, specifically the ancient Greek colony of Massalia. It was founded in about 600 BCE. Today it's known as the city of Marseille in the south of France. One of the most famous people who lived in that Greek colony of Massalia was named Pythias. And approximately 330 BCE or so, he set out on an extraordinary voyage, as you can see in this work by Dr. Barry Cunliffe of Oxford University. And really, Pythias is almost an archetypal quester. So he set out on this voyage into the unknown. No one knows exactly what the route was that he took. Dr. Cunliffe believes that he started by going up the Aude River, right past the future site of Carcassonne, where the Open Center Conference took place last year, as Ralph mentioned. Continued down on the Atlantic side, and then journeyed north, and kept going north until he arrived at a mysterious place known as Thule. And when he got to Thule, he wrote a remarkable description of what it was like there. He said, just north of Thule is a zone where the earth and the sea and the sky are no longer distinct. They all blend together and become one thing. And this one thing, it's impossible to walk on it, it's impossible to sail on it. And so this casts a very liminal quality to this mysterious location called Thule, a place where the opposites fuse together and possibilities open up. Now, ever since Pytheas wrote about this, people have been arguing about where he went. Where was this mysterious place called Thule? Many people believe that it was Iceland. Barry Cunliffe believes that Thule is a reference to Iceland. If so, this introduces Iceland to the Western imagination for the first time as a mysterious and liminal place, and it keeps going with this theme. 1634. Shortly after the death of Johannes Kepler, the famous scientist, a work of his was published posthumously, and this is regarded as the first work of science fiction, his story, The Dream. And in this fictional work, a person is trying to journey to the moon. So he wants to set this journey to the moon, beginning in the part of the Earth that's actually closest to the moon. And where did Kepler pick for that launch? Iceland. So the theme continues. 1864, the famous novel by Jules Verne, Journey to the Center of the Earth. So here, instead of going beyond, going where no one has gone before, into space, he sets an adventure going below, beneath the surface, to the center of the Earth. And where did he pick to begin this journey to access the subterranean realms? Iceland, and specifically Snaefellsness, where the conference is going to be held this summer. So we have Iceland since antiquity in the Western imagination connected to going beyond and also going beneath. And going beyond and going beneath are the central themes of the Esoteric Quest. So I think it's highly appropriate that we pay some attention and, if possible, make a physical quest to Iceland. So now the outer north, a little bit of a hello to some basic anchor points in history. I believe Dr. Erlendsson is going to provide more detail about this, but just to start the ball rolling, we think of Scandinavia generally. There's evidence of human habitation ever since the withdrawal of the end of the Ice Age. We certainly know by 5,000 years ago, ancestors of the Finno-Baltic peoples were there. One of these became the Sami people, very famous in Scandinavia for shamanic practices. We have by 4,000 years ago Germanic peoples, the ancestors of Scandinavians. Most famously, at least for non-Scandinavians, is the great period of expansion, often known as the Viking Age. Sometimes the anchor points are drawn from 793, which was the attack on the British monastery at Lindisfarne, to 1066, which is the Norman conquest. So roughly bracketed by those dates, there was this great expansion of Scandinavian influence, not just the raping and pillaging that people sometimes associate it with, but a great deal of trading and settling and intermarriage as well. So this great expansion. Christianity arrived on the scene, and gradually the many chieftains and lords consolidated into kingdoms over a time period. And this is how some of the Vikings got about. There's still some of these amazing ships preserved that sail through the Western imagination ever since. Specifically to Iceland, we don't know how early the first people were who showed up in Iceland. It's believed that before the Norse arrived, there were at least some Gaelic monks present, but during the 9th, 10th centuries was the period of Norse settlement. Christianity, specifically Roman Catholicism, was adopted in the year 1000, and this was a very peaceful adoption, by the way. It was an act of adopted by vote. The 13th, 14th centuries were a period of great political turmoil, but really for our purposes a literary golden age when many extremely important texts were compiled and composed, comprising really our main source of knowledge about the Old Norse mythology and legendary and spirituality. Iceland converted to Protestantism in the 1500s, and one more anchor point, the Republic of Iceland, Republic of Iceland, founded in the dying days of World War II, 1944. Here we can see a glimpse at the great reach of the Scandinavian presence in terms of trading and settlements and raiding. Note that arrow in the upper corner there as well, because also included is the eastern coast of North America. And in fact, just a couple of days ago, an announcement was made of a probable discovery of a new Viking settlement site in Newfoundland in Canada. So that's an exciting development right there. Now let's go into the inner north territory. Just as a reminder of how pervasive the influence of the Old Norse spirituality was and really remains beneath the surface of the broader culture, let's think for a moment about the names of the days of the week. We have Saturday for Saturn, Sunday for the sun, Monday for the moon. But the other 4 days of the week in the English-speaking world are all named after Old Norse deities. Tuesday, named after Tu or Tyr. Wednesday is Woden's Day or Odin's Day. Thursday, Thunor's Day or Thor's Day. And Friday, Frigg's or Freyja's Day. So these are all Old Norse gods that we evoke probably at least 4 times a week as we go through our calendars. How do we know what we know about the Old Norse inner world? Well, we have to rely on remains in the outer world. Archaeologists study artifacts of various kinds. We have inscriptions on stone and bone and wood to analyze as well. The study of names is very important. Place names can tell us a lot, and also the names of people. For example, in Iceland, to my knowledge, there are no settlements named after the god Odin. But Thor is very much present in terms of place names and people names. So this suggests that the prominence of Odin in the text evidence that we've got might not match the prominence of Odin in the broader culture. Speaking of the texts, we have some extremely precious texts to study that really perhaps are our main source of knowledge about the Old Norse aspects of things. And last but not least, people's experiences. Some people today who are alive delve into these matters in a very subjective way, and possibly their experiences can cast some lights on interpreting the other sources of information and knowledge that we've got. Such as the Codex Regius. This is a great treasure that was compiled in the 13th century, but it's a collection of poetry, the Poetic Edda, and it's thought that the contents of the poems go back centuries prior to its compilation, reflecting aspects of the pre-Christian Old Norse worldview. This book has been around. It's called the Codex Regius, or Royal Book, because it was sent as a gift to the King of Denmark in the 17th century, and it was not until 1971 that it was repatriated to Iceland. But this is a profound treasure and a real important source of glimpsing into the inner north. The first poem in the collection is the Prophecy of the Sibyl, the Völuspá, and hopefully when we're in Reykjavik we can view this wonderful work of art by one of Iceland's most renowned artists, Stained Glass Window. The texts. There are many texts, but just to cast a brief spotlight on some of them, the Poetic Edda, or Codex Regius, is the main compilation of these poems. Edda, by the way, is a somewhat mysterious name. In the old Icelandic, it means the great-grandmother, but whether that's what it means in these contexts is a topic of debate. The Sibyl's prophecy I mentioned, which is really key to an understanding of these old materials, and I'm sure that there'll be a lot of focus on the Sibyl's prophecy at our conference. The sayings of the High One, the sayings of Vafthrudnir, and there are many more poems in the Poetic Edda that are very entertaining and also very profound. Another important text is the Prose Edda by the renowned Snorri Sturluson, also compiled or composed in the 13th century, and it's actually a manual for training Icelandic poets in the old traditions of poetry. But those old traditions of poetry require a deep knowledge of the old myths and legends, and so Snorri recorded a lot of very interesting material there. One of the challenges with all of these texts is that they were compiled or composed during the Christian era. And so we're trying to look back at the pagan era and pagan forms of thought, in effect, through a filter of Christian compilers and authors. And that creates a lot of challenge and a lot of debate and a lot of doctoral dissertations trying to sort out the extent to which these texts give us an accurate reflection of the older world, but they're invaluable nonetheless. The first part after the prologue in the Prose Edda is a strange story about the king of Sweden who's seeking knowledge, and he, under disguise, he visits a great hall and meets these three characters, and they have a discussion where he asks questions and they reveal all kinds of interesting knowledge about the old worldview. And it turns out that all three of these mysterious characters are actually Odin in disguise. So this is well worth a look. More texts. There's a 14th century collection, the Hauksbok, which is quite valuable if you're very interested in that poem, The Prophecy of the Sibyl, because it contains an alternative version to that found in the Poetic Edda. And so for comparison's sake, that's quite valuable. Probably best known are the sagas. Snorri composed the Saga of the Ynglings, which is the beginning of the history of the kings of Norway, and it contains important mythological material. And perhaps most famous of all, the Saga of the Volsungs, which is really an important basis of the great adventures that evolve into the material that Wagner used, for example, in the Ring cycle. There are also poems that are known as skaldic poems, a slightly different style of poetry than the Eddaic poems in the Poetic Edda. And last but not least, there are many collections of magical spell books, the grimoires, dating from about the 15th right into the 20th century, which cast another angle, another viewpoint on the old Icelandic perspective. These make an interesting study looking at both the links and the distinctions of the Icelandic magical traditions compared to the mainland continental European traditions, which actually have their roots going back to ancient Egypt. And we do see connections in the Icelandic material, but also important differences. If you look in some of these grimoires, we'll see a lot of diagrams that look like snowflakes. These are the staves. And the most famous one of all is the Æshjálmur, the so-called Helm of Awe, or Helmet of Awe. This is a protection spell, and anywhere there is the presence of Icelandic culture, you will probably notice the Æshjálmur here and there. So the Sami people, not in Iceland, but in the Scandinavia, very well known for shamanism, involving using the beating of drums as a mean of inducing the trance state to journey to the other world. You can see in this collection of the drum heads of the Sami, there are diagrams, including diagrams of what are trees. These are special trees that act as really the spine of the universe, or the central axis of the universe, and the shamans journey up and down that tree, visiting the upper world and the lower world and the hidden aspects of this world. There's a debate about whether this Sami shamanism influenced some of the old Scandinavian practices, or whether the influence goes the other way, or whether the shamanic practice is both Germanic and Sami. But it's worth noting that this is another interesting issue to explore, shamanism and the relationship between the Sami and the Scandinavians. I love this thing. No one quite knows what it means. It comes from Gotland, which is an island, the biggest island in the Baltic Sea in Scandinavia. It's very old, and it's certainly a remarkable-looking object. And one wonders, is that a shaman being portrayed there? What's happening? But it's worth a meditation. We have the tradition of the berserkers, which is also interesting. The famous warriors who allegedly would go into an altered state of consciousness, dressed as bears, and become ferocious and perhaps invincible warriors. Once again, there's debate about the extent to which this is a reflection of shamanic practice or other forms of practice. And then we arrive at the great mythological world of the Norse. The PARACOSM, or world of spiritual imagination, that's caught the imagination of the world really ever since. It has a timeline attached to it, going from before creation to the end of the world, the famous RAGNARÖK. We have, in terms of its geography, a central tree. And again, this is resonant of the Sami shamanic view, the famous Yggdrasil, which literally means the horse of the terrorizer. And who is the terrorizer is none other than Odin, who is thought to journey around the universe by going up and down the tree. So the tree is his horse. And this kind of makes Odin seem like a shamanic character. There's reference in the prophecy of the Sibyl poem to 9 worlds, but the Sibyl does not name the 9 worlds. So that opens some interesting debate about which worlds she's talking about. And of course, these 9 worlds are inhabited. Before the beginning, according to some of these stories, was the primordial void, the Ginnungagap, where there was really nothing solid. Then there appears a world of ice and a world of fire, which move toward each other and they interact, creating a liminal zone, a zone of fertile possibility, giving rise to the very first being, Ymir, the ice, the frost giant. Later on, Odin and his brothers kill Ymir, and they make the material universe out of his body parts. And so it begins. These 9 worlds are often identified like this. We're living in Midgard, the Aesir, the sky gods roughly are in the famous Asgard, the Vanir, gods of the earth, in Vanaheim, the giants, the Jotnar, in Jotunheim, and then we have elves and dwarves and interesting creatures in other worlds, the world of fire, the world of ice, and hell, the world of the dead. And there's some variation. Some sources connect the world of ice with the world of the dead, so that makes room for another 9th world, Nidavellir. And it's quite interesting to see how people have tried to arrange these worlds and connect them to Yggdrasil. There's not necessarily one correct way to do this, but it's fascinating to look at different people's attempts to organize these worlds in various ways. And even using Lego. In a lot of traditions, giants hold up the sky, but not in the Old Norse tradition. It's actually dwarves. So there are 4 dwarves of the directions holding up the sky. And some of the most interesting archaeological evidence of the Old Norse presence, by the way, come from the British Isles. So this object, the Hazem hogback, comes from England. And you can make out perhaps the 4 dwarves holding up the sky. Let's say a quick hello to 5 deities. And here's a curious feature. We often think of deities as immortal, but not the Norse deities. They actually can die. Mortal deities. And this creates almost a backdrop of anxiety through Norse mythology, which is very strange and very powerful, and some would say makes Norse mythology especially relevant to our world today, which has been called an age of anxiety. So here are 5 very well-known deities, and let's say a quick hello to each of these 5. Here we have a wonderful tapestry showing Odin and Thor, who's in some sources his son, and in some sources his remote ancestor, and also the god Frey. Frey is one of the Vanir, and Thor and Odin are among the Aesir. we look closely at this carving from that wonderful Oseberg ship in Norway, you can see this entangled set of triangles, which is the Valknut, the knot of the fallen, or fallen warriors, and this is a symbol associated with Odin. So where we see this, we think of the god Odin, who's a very curious god. He is the king, the leader of the Aesir, the sky gods, and yet he's also, for central deity, very marginal. So he really captures the liminality itself. He's usually portrayed as journeying around on a quest for knowledge very often anonymously, often in disguise. He's also the god of poetry, which might explain why the poets really feature Odin in a much more prominent manner than, say, the other evidence of place names and people names. Because he's the god of the poets, they're going to foreground him. He had an 8-legged horse, and so that's why many scholars think this is a portrayal of the god Odin on one of his journeys, seeking knowledge, perhaps. Look at this fantastic picture stone from the island Gotland. If we look very closely at it, at this particular part of it, a close-up, we see the Falknut. So this is a scene associated with Odin. And curiously, if you look to the left, there's a character appears to be hanging on the tree. And the sayings of the Great One from the poetic Edda talk about Odin deliberately hanging himself from a tree for 9 days and 9 nights, and in fact sacrificing himself to himself. It's very strange behavior, but he was engaged apparently in a self-sacrifice in order to acquire esoteric knowledge of some kind. And so this appears to be a portrayal of that remarkable feat of self-sacrifice. And this too has been connected to shamanic tropes and traditions of journeying on the tree. Thor is very popular in movies nowadays. This is a little treasure from northern Iceland depicting Thor with his famous hammer known as Hjálmir. He was a god of storms and thunder, and very importantly, the protector of the Aesir from attacks by the giants. Here's a depiction from Denmark. It's likely one of Thor's adventures. One day he went out into the ocean to fish, and he ends up confronting the Midgard serpent, the giant dragon-like serpent. And he catches it and has a big fight with it, and ultimately it gets away, but he will confront the Midgard serpent again in RAGNARÖK at the end of the world. This has been identified as Thor, by the way, because if you look closely, you can see his foot sticking through the bottom of his boat. And this occurred during the mighty struggle with the Midgard serpent at the end of his line. The story is that his foot went through the boat. Frey, one of the Vanir, who comes to live with the Aesir to make peace with them, a god of fertility and reproduction. And if you look very closely at this little bronze object, you'll notice why scholars think this is Frey. And then there's Freya, one of the Vanir who also come to live with the Aesir, known for her magic and her evocation of lust and love. I love the fact she rides a chariot of cats, and is often, because of her allure, causes all manner of trouble. But a riveting and alluring divinity she is. Loki is trouble. He really is another very liminal being, born from the giants, also connected to the Aesir. He actually ends up leading the giants in battle against the Aesir during Ragnarök, which ends up destroying the world. He arranges, through a little trick, for the death of Odin's son Baldur, which is one of the signs that Ragnarök is about to begin, probably. And so here we see Loki, who is imprisoned and being tortured by having a terrible serpent's venom dribbling onto his head. But he escapes, and then Ragnarök begins. He has some nasty children, Loki does. Hel, the goddess of the underworld Hel, that 8-legged horse that Odin rides, Fenrir, the wolf. During Ragnarök, Fenrir kills Odin, and then the Midgard serpent. During Ragnarök, the serpent kills Thor, but Thor manages to kill the serpent. And this may be actually a portrayal of that mighty serpent, which takes us to the end of the world, variously noted as RAGNARÖK or RAGNARÖKKI, the doom of the gods or the twilight of the gods. Balder dies through the trick of Loki, and then all hell breaks loose, and the giants arrive, and Thor and Midgard's serpent interact, Odin and Fenrir, the world, the entire universe goes up in flames. But according to the prophecy of the Sibyl, the world is reborn, and there are some humans there who start a new beginning at a place called Gimle. And the final scene in the poem, the great winged serpent Nidhogg, who appears in the sky. And that's a very ominous way to end the vision. Here we have a look at what's believed to be Fenrir the wolf biting biting Odin, and that's the end of the ruler of the Aesir right there. So I should, at this point, I think, wrap up just to note that the cultural influence has rippled and roared through time ever since. Certainly we have during the Romantic period, the Norse mythology really making a deep impression in culture. We know that the sagas really inspired Wagner in the Ring cycle, portraying the old heroes and the old deities in many ways. We have Rudolf Steiner, the great esotericist, who indicated he thought that Norse mythology was actually the deepest mythology of all, and the one best suited for a serious study in modern times. And of course, in popular culture, there's all kinds of influence of the Old Norse tradition continuing. And not just in pop culture, but even in serious spirituality. There are various groups and movements who are attuning again to the spiritual dimensions and the old divinities rising again. Just to wrap up, a few book recommendations if anyone's interested in delving. This is one of my favorites as an introductory text because it gives quite a succinct overview of the Old Norse viewpoints, but also looks at the reception history, how the Norse material has influenced through time. You'll want to read translations of the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda for sure. I like this Penguin translation by Jesse Byock, and the Oxford translation of the Poetic Edda by Caroline Larrington, but there are many other translations available. And I find this a handy book as well. It's a little compendium of knowledge about the Old Norse spiritual legacy by John Lindo. And so we continue our quest, and who knows where it will take us. Perhaps and hopefully it will take us to Iceland to consider the mysteries of the North later this year. I thank you all for your attention and turn the helm over to Dr. Erlendsson. Thank you.
Yes, hello everyone, and thank you, Leonard, for a very interesting talk. I will cover or go a bit deeper into some of the points you have covered. That's just our country in her winter clothes, the goddess. She's always called the goddess, the land itself. Really, the key points I'm going to cover is a little bit about the language, the Indo-European language, and the kind of cultural source of the Indo-Europeans before Christianity arrived in the Caucasus Mountains. I will cover a little bit of the start of the Icelandic Commonwealth and the Parliament, one of the oldest in the world. And again, covering the kind of the high point of culture in the 13th century, which was created by numerous influences, as Leonard has covered, and everything from the shamanic culture of the Sams, Samic people, to Christianity, to Nordic, and even Greek influence philosophy. I will be dwelling a little bit on the kind of Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and the influence of the Varangian Guard of Istanbul or Constantinople, and finally discussing really the core spirituality of certainly the Icelandic Norse, which was about how you contact God or the divine through nature itself. Now, starting off with the Indo-European languages, it is now believed that the beginning of that culture, we don't know, 4, 6, 8,000 years ago, was in the highest mountains of Europe, in the eastern part of the Black Sea. And from there, we have language development reaching all the way to India and Persia, up to Greece and Italy, to the Romans, and up to the Scandinavians and Germans, and then east to Russia and the Slavic languages. And really, before Christianity, they shared a basic spiritual understanding of the sky, of the land, and of the human body, and the journey of the soul and the inner worlds. And I think there's a lot of links between Icelandic spirituality and the yogas of India. Now, starting just with the Indo-European and the Caucasus Mountains, again, the highest mountain in Europe, Mount Elbrus, is on the east side of the Black Sea, and there you see all these arrows moving of east to India and down to Turkey, Persia, Greece, Italy, to the Germans and up to Scandinavians. And this really starts many thousands before Christ. Some say 4,000, 5,000, or perhaps even much older. Now, in the Icelandic literary tradition of Snorri Sturluson, which Leonard mentioned, who wrote in the 13th century, was educated in the only school in Iceland at Oddi. And there it was said that Odin had come from the Caucasus Mountains to Sweden, not far from Stockholm, and settled in Sigtuna, and the main temples were held in Uppsala, where they raised 3 big hills, which you see on the upper right side, and they built a great temple, and there they worshipped mainly the 3 gods of Wodan, Thor, and Freya. And I think it's important, building on what Leonard was saying, is that in many ways, like Buddhism, the Nordic mythology is inherently psychological. It's all about man and his soul and his journey of transformation. And Wodan stands for really the wisdom nature, Thor for the kind of battle with our lower energies, the giants, the passions, and Freya more how we relate to people and the outer world. So they stand for these different parts of the human being. Now, I think the core essence of the Nordic mythology is really about Wodan. Thor certainly was important in Scandinavia and perhaps in Iceland, as Leonard has said. But Wodan is known under many names, and he's rarely called Wodan in Iceland. He has many other names, and Bardur is certainly the main one. What really is the key in Wodan's mysteries is all about death. And I think what he's describing, as we know maybe from North American tradition, that they possibly use drugs and possibly near-death experience to bring about transformation. We know from modern studies of Grayson in the States how often near-death experiences really bring out profound spiritual awakening, even Kundalini experiences like the dragon, as well as inner sight, the single eye, which really is important in its mysteries. And as Leonard has said, one of the key kind of elements of his stories is where he offers himself to himself, or the ego, or the day consciousness, gives up his hold on life to make a link with a profounder element in itself. And we have a similar story from Grimnismal, which is another of these old texts, where Wodan comes in as a guest into the palace of Geirröð and is tortured for 8 days. That can also be seen as a metaphor for maybe a spiritual practice leading to the edge of life and death. Also, really in Valhalla or Woden's palace, we have multiple warriors, even 432,000 warriors, and they are all on a spiritual quest, and each day they battle to death for the next day to awaken. And for them, the key thing is to make link with their feminine internal being, the Valkyrie. Valkyrie literally means death song. Val can mean death or choosing, and Kyrie the song. So it really the myth of Wotan is very similar to the Jungian ideas of individuation, integrating various aspects of the conscious and unconscious self.
Excuse me, Haraldur?
Yep.
Hi, I wonder if you could possibly angle your webcam a little bit to have more of your face in the presentation?
Sorry, say that again?
Can you angle your... Are you on a laptop? Can you angle your monitor a little bit so that... Yeah, so more of your... Yeah, that's better. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, thank you. So I think the key, and I think we hear more about the Viking age and how courageous they were as warriors. And I think that's partly because death wasn't such a big issue, and it's more your actions and your honor and your deeds that mattered. So they had really an amazing courage when they were facing death. And now with the Indo-European countries, nature is really key. And all the way from India to Iceland, it's the mountains that are seen as the abodes of the gods. And in India, we can perhaps mention two mountains, Kailasa or Mount Meru, which in Hinduism is the high palace, the high city of the gods, certainly of the early Vedic Indra and later on Shiva. And Buddha takes on that mountain later on, and certainly with both the Tibetan Burn religion and Indian Jain religion, that continues to be the center of the spiritual world. Now in the south of India, we have a very interesting mountain called Nilgiri, or the Blue Mountains. And there we have the legend of the hermit Agastya, who really lays the foundation of spiritual practices. All the yogas are said to come from him. Now we know very well from Greece, Mount Olympus, which is the city of the gods, where Zeus rules as the mountain king. But even higher mountains are called the Idi, Oros. Idi is also an Icelandic goddess. She is really the great mother of all. And actually in the early Greek tradition, it was the mountain of the goddess. Or later on, they became the mountain of Zeus. She has a few versions of its names, and they're found both in Turkey and Cyprus and elsewhere. Now in Iceland, this is really key for understanding the connection Icelanders even have to this day to the land, is that we have named deities in every mountain almost in Iceland, from the grand deities to the 400 first settlers who more or less were seen as Woden's warriors, the guardians of the land. And I will show you a few of these mountains. First of all, it's the mountain Leonard has already mentioned, where we will meet in August, the Snaefellsness, the abode of Haraldur, who in fact is Woden himself. He is the goddess of learning and magic, and the first lawyers like Tunguadur in Iceland, they learned law from him. He's a teacher of magic, and he in many ways, like other lords of mountains, take apprentices and they marry his daughters, and they move out in the world to become a great man of power and knowledge. Now near Reykjavik we have the mountain Esja, which is the mother of the gods, just like Idi Oros in Greece. And there are in fact two mountains in Iceland, one near Reykjavik and one on the east. Now we also have a very interesting mountain called Ármannsfell, near the Parliament Place, Alþingi, or Þingvellir, which is dedicated to Ármann. Ármann is a very interesting god, and we hear about him really all the way back to India. He's one of the early Vedic gods. It's called spelled Aryaman in Hindu text, and it's all about love of fascination, of healing, of friendship and hospitality. We see him in the Zoroastrian religion in the name of the priest caste, the Aryaman, and a great angel of the Zoroastrians, the Ishya Aryaman, who the Manichaean tradition takes up in the 3rd century and calls Jesus Yiso Aryaman as the god of love and healing. Now in Arman, we don't know very much about him in Norway, but certainly in Iceland, he becomes the guardian of the midsummer celebration, the High Parliament, which was held once a year. And these celebrations are very similar to many of the mysteries of Mithras, which are known certainly within the Roman world. Slaying the ox and meeting the dragon, etc., etc. Carrying on with the sacred mountains, in the Parliament oaths we have mentioned 3 of the main gods, male gods. Njörður, who is the god of the sea, Freyr, which we heard about, god of love, and the Almighty God, which is usually Baldur. And here on the image you can see the snow mountains in the east and west, which are for the Almighty God, and in the north and south the solar mountains of Njörður, and the 5 mountains at the center are called the Blue Mountains, and they're linked with the Freyr, the goddess of knowledge, of love and connection. Now also interestingly, the 3 largest glaciers in Iceland are also a part of the mythological landscape. In the west, we have what is today called the Long Glacier, but this is only called Long Glacier following Christianity. As we know from the Scandinavian, especially in Swedish tradition, the metaphors were really sexual, as we find again in India. Shiva is often shown with an erect penis or with a circular stone standing for his penis. And that glacier was called Penis Glacier in the heathen times. And the largest glacier is called today Breiðamerkurjökull, or the Broad Glacier, but in the older times were more or less called the Pussy Glacier, or Klofajökull in Icelandic. Now the central glacier, who more or less is the center of the Icelandic mandala, with all the 400 whatever warriors around Iceland, almost like the 432 warriors of Valhalla. But at the center we have the temple, and there we have the dragon, the 2 eagles of the tree. We have the bull. So we have a lot of the symbology of the Nordic mythology and Woden's temple. Now, at the heart of Icelandic spirituality, really from the start, and we can point out where that came from, whether it's from the Psalms or the shamanic lapse in the north of Norway, or whether it was really part of the core Nordic tradition. But this is really about sitting out in nature. And we know that both the kind of spiritual discipline for men and women was about staying out in the highlands, near the mountains, stay in the silence and have your vision open to see the sacred, because we have a sense that not only the mountains, but really the space itself is charged with a sacred presence. And many of the Icelandic sagas, especially Grettir saga, Grettir, English would mean great, is our equivalent of the labors of Hercules. And he spends a lot of time alone up in the highlands, challenging his own nature. But we have similar folklore about outlaws. But interestingly, as Christianity took hold in Iceland, what was called útisetur, or sitting outside, became the arch sin of an Icelander, so serious that only a bishop could forgive you such a grave omission. Now, you can't really talk about Nordic or Icelandic culture without mentioning the Roman Empire. Roman Empire was partly formed by the invasion of the Germanic nation from the north, but early on, really from the 1st century onwards, they started to become mercenaries, and there was a lot of commerce between the two. As we came to the latter part of the 2,000 years of the Roman Empire, we started to struggle and sought help from the Germanic nations. Now, one of the biggest influence, I think, on Scandinavian culture, and certainly in the path that came to Iceland, is from Attila the Hun. The Mongolians invaded most of the known world in the 5th century, and the capital became in Hungary, on the border of the Roman Empire. And one of the key associated Germanic tribes were the so-called Heruli, who were fierce warriors, and the story says that they came from the east of the Black Sea and perhaps went to Scandinavia, went down. They had been near the Black Sea again before Attila came, and we know they plundered Athens and other places of the Greek world. What is interesting in the really warfare tactics of Attila is their unusual horse, which is slightly different from the rest of the world, with this different gait, and even though it is relatively small, it has amazing endurance, so it allows for quite intense assaults and withdrawals, which was the key techniques of the Huns. Here we have an image of the Mongolian horse, and interestingly, genetically we now know the Icelandic horse is in fact the Mongolic horse, not found anywhere else than now in Mongolia and in Iceland. And it gives us an idea that the people who moved to Iceland in the 9th century, they were people who really was awaiting control. They were fiercely independent. Each farmer, each landowner was an independent person who would not be ruled by anyone else. So when the attempts to unify Norway, then these people moved to Iceland. We in fact know that Icelandic, even though it's Norwegian is most related to it, it's also really part of East Germanic nations, just like my name is Haraldur. All this ending, similar to the os in Greece, is not really found in Scandinavia at all. So there are interesting links. And there are also very many fierce traditions of the early Icelanders, which was similar to the Herulis. To avoid having too many children, they would put their children out to die out in nature. They would offer them to the gods. A little bit about the Vikings, we've already heard from Leonard, the invasion in the UK in the 8th century. And the real trigger is their art of shipbuilding, which really reached its maximum in the 10th, 11th century. So that was really the horse of the Vikings, which they possibly got from Attila the Hun, and the shipbuilding really made it possible for them to invade and take over lots of land all over Europe and Greenland, and as Leonard has said, in Newfoundland and elsewhere. And what was interesting for them, as the quest has gone to Sicily, they were really key in Sicily as they took over South Italy and Sicily to integrate various cultures. And that was certainly their strong point, that they had dialogue between many traditions. They were very philosophically thinking, even though the modern concept of a Viking was first and foremost a fierce and ruthless warrior. Again, a little bit about the Roman Empire. As it started to lose land from the Goths and the Huns and the Muslims, it became poorer. It no longer had the food from Egypt and Syria. It no longer had the money from the Silk Roads from China. And it didn't really have the manpower to fight the further invasions. And that's where really the Germanic people came in, and really from the 1st century onwards, they were really key for protecting the Roman Empire. And in the 10th century, they became a formal guardians of the empire. And they were more or less in power next to the emperor. They were personal bodyguards, and they remained so for almost 400 years. And they were used sparingly because they were more or less the elite force, the most skilled force of the empire. And even when the emperor died, they had first right to the treasury of the state. So it was considered not only a place of honor to serve, but good for money. And people came from all over Scandinavia and Iceland, and later on, to the latter ages, from England to serve in the emperor's guard. This is, I think, very important to understand Icelandic culture, that it was influenced from many places. And one of the key influences, besides their own Nordic culture, was the art of warfare, engineering, surveying, navigation, and philosophy, and not only Christian, but Greek. Now, Leonard mentioned many modern and relatively older myths, including that of Pythias, that relate to Iceland, but there are actually a number of them. We have them in India, where they're called Uttarakuru, or the land of the Siddhas, where it's said that is far north, and it is where the sun rises when it sets in India. We have it even in Homer's Odyssey, where there's this legend of an island called Ogygia, inhabited by descendants of Hercules, and there ruled the goddess Calypso. Calypso more or less means the goddess of esoteric knowledge, and she held Homer hostage there and offered him eternal life. Now, and as it already mentioned, the Plutarch myth of the Pythias myth, but we have an interesting myth also from Plutarch, which was the high priest of Delphi. He says, and I'll come to that a bit later, that there were regular travels to the island of Ogygia. We have also similar myths from the Burgundians in Germany, of Brynhilda in the Nibelunglied, which was from Iceland. We have myths in Ireland about the Western Isles, which Tolkien takes up in his story about the place of the immortals. And we have similar myths in Scotland. So there are a lot in the old cultures about what we possibly call today Iceland. Now, what Plutarch says in his book On the Face of the Moon is that every 30 years, as Saturn approached the sign of Taurus in the sky, which happened every 30 years, worthy disciples all over the Greek world were selected to take a voyage to Ogygia, to stay there for 30 years for learning. And so that was seen as the stronghold of esoteric knowledge. And they say that in Ogygia you could both see and hear the gods. So it has a thin veil between the physical and the spiritual. Coming to the founding of Iceland in the 9th century, interestingly, the legend says that at the time the lord of the area where most Icelanders came from, in Sognfjord, was Atli Jarl, which could almost say that it was Attila the Hun and the heralds. And the parliament there, called Gulathing, was slightly different from the rest of Norway. And this is very interesting. It kind of again argues that the people who moved from Norway to Iceland were of slightly different background. The first settlers in Iceland were called Ingolf and Hjörleif, and their names indicate both a link with the wolf, just like we have in Rome of Romulus and Remus, the two sons of the Wolverine, who became the first kings of Rome. Now, the Snorri describes in his book about the first 4 people who found Iceland. and it relates to 4 names of Iceland. Iceland is only one of 4 names of the land. It is the lowest name of the land. The land of we have one of the Icelandic poems is called Ríksþula, and it talks about 4 types of people: slaves, which live for the mundane world, carls or men who are caretakers of others, and earls who develop an interest in philosophy and spirituality, and kings were really people who have entered the divine realm. And the 4 names of the land, Iceland, Garðarsholmi or Gardenland, Snæland or Snowland, and Tili, which is same as Thule, are really these 4 levels of Icelandic culture. Now, Leonard has already mentioned the 4 dwarfs and guardians. We have, for each part of the 4 part of the lands, we have a particular guardian, and this really relates to the 4 stars or guardians of the zodiac, which in Nordic mythology are more or less called north, south, east, and west. But we also in the key myth of Völuspá, the Sibyl's prophecy, we have also the other 2 stars, which is the wolf and the harp, which is the 2 brightest stars of the fixed sky. And these are really seen as the origin of many of the early myths of Iceland, because we have, Snorri describes a story of the whale, the magical whale, trying to go into Iceland, and there were 4 guardians, a dragon, an eagle and all the birds, a bull and a giant, who guarded the 4 directions of the country. And it hints also at attempting to approach the land where the highest mountain is. So really we have these 6 guardians, the whale, the 4 classical guardians, and the spirit of the mountain. And the highest mountain in Iceland is named after the plant you see, which is Angelica, and Archangelica, which probably was dedicated to Wotan as the highest spiritual element. Now, as the Commonwealth was founded, it did not have any king, different from Norway. Each landowner was independent within his own realm, but there were 36 of these Goths who were kind of priest kings, and they served temples, and they served as local judges. And we had also smaller parliaments, but once a year at midsummer, all of them met with their sub-Goths for a parliament meeting at midsummer. And we know, certainly in astrology and the early Egyptian traditions, where they spoke about the 36 guardians of the sky, who were kind of timekeepers, who were watchers of the world. They were used for navigation and timekeeping. Here we have an image from Thingvellir, where the parliament met, and in the background we have the mountain of Ármann, was the guardian of the proceedings. Now, we have a very interesting story in Íslendingabók, or the Book of Icelanders, where it says that a man who again came from Sognfjord in Norway and lived in East Iceland, who could be more or less translated as Grim Goat Shoe. Goat Shoe, perhaps he would climb over mountains or whatever. And he was given the task of finding a place for the High Parliament. And every person in the land paid him tax to survey the land and decide. And the purple circle, you can see where the arrow ends, is where Thingvellir is. And more or less what he did, he defined the westernmost point and southernmost point of the land, divided that line into 5 parts, and where the 2 and 3 parts met, 2 being the symbol of the mother, 3 being the symbol of the father, where the 2 met, that's where the parliament was held. Again, it shows the importance of geometry and the sacred landscape. This is again, in Iceland we have 3 mountains named after Ármann, the guardian of the parliament. And here we can see them, and they form an isosceles triangle. In the middle of the triangle, we have an interesting place called Borðeyri, straight north of Þingvellir. And this is really key place in the Bárðar saga, which is the saga of the high god, the saga of Wodan in Iceland, and it tells of how Gest takes on the king in the North Pole, if you like, where his forefather had been the high king of. And here we see another similar pattern of the snow mountains. We have two double isosceles triangle really centered on Borðeyri. And as I understand it, that this is the place where you meet your own darkness, where whatever obstructs your connection with your spiritual self is removed. Now, this is something that Leonard has already talked about, the year 1000, where we more under duress, we considered to become Christian. The high priest at the time, Þorgeir Ljósvetning Góði, he used the old shamanic way of going into trance for 3 days. And as he returned from the trance, he made his decision that all Icelanders should be baptized. However, and this is the most important part of his decision, and it led really to the high culture of Iceland. He said all are allowed to practice the heathen tradition in secret. And this is very important because this created an exceptional culture in Iceland where all the educated, including the priest, were the expert of Nordic mythology and Nordic tradition. So his decision really formed the high culture. And the Goðar, the Goths, the priests in Iceland of the Nordic tradition, were like the Brahmins. They were inheritable posts. But these became the families of the priest, and the old temples became the places of the churches. So it was a very wise kind of Solomon-like decision. But as kind of one of the final points is about Snorri Sturluson, which Leonard has already mentioned, who learned in the first really school of the Icelandic tradition, who integrated the Nordic and the Christian tradition, and who became even the high lawsayer, more or less the king of midsummer on many occasions in Iceland. He wrote down or gathered together many of the stories. And I think it's important to understand that the sagas and the poems we have from the Nordic tradition, they are very psychological, and also the sagas are not really factual, even though they're set in a factual term. They are really the old myths set in modern Icelandic 12th, 13th century scene. So that's really the essence, and really the essence is that Nordic mythology is really very psychological, and it is about the transformation of self, connecting with the inner reality, facing death, awakening the processes relating to the return of the soul to its source. And all the gods and both the Æsir and the Vanir and the Thursar, which are the primitive giants, they are really psychological elements within yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Haraldur. We'll turn back now to Ralph White.
Yes, thank you very much, Haraldur, for that. And thank you, Leonard, too. I actually wanted to say just a few words about Haraldur before we go on. We now have some time for questions. But I want to say again how invaluable Haraldur has been in making this quest come about. When I flew to Iceland in October to set things up, he very graciously met me at the airport, and he has introduced me and the Open Center to many of the presenters who will be joining us in Iceland. Haraldur he's a psychiatrist. He is a fourth generation esotericist. He has just published a new book, The Man Who Drew Triangles. And there will be an interview with Haraldur coming up in the next issue of Quest News, so you can find out more about him. So thanks again, Haraldur and Leonard. And now let's just open it up to questions for this last 10 minutes or so. They could be questions to either Leonard or Haraldur, or they could be practical questions about the quest also addressed to me. So Pete, can you just go over how people pose questions?